A warning to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers. This presentation contains the names, images, and material from people who have passed away. Hi Jess. Welcome to my assessment task 3, how I learned to stop worrying about the line and love the spirals. Part 1, getting the knowledge on the line. Locating myself, Clack, on Turrbal country within Northside Brisbane. So this is the beautiful Westfield Chermy. Oh, sorry, just gotta go back. There we go. There's Chermy. Alright, so Clack is my nickname and that's how I identify myself. And because this project's partly about developing a relationship between myself and Turrbal country, that's why I'm using a more personal name. So before the I&D units, I really didn't understand the concept of having a relationship with country. That was a totally new concept for me to get my head around. Because I didn't know that country has awareness as such. Like, I knew that trees and plants are living things, but I didn't understand that they have awareness and that people can have a relationship with country. But in July 2021, I did I&D 203 Caring for Country, so I started to get the hang of it. Very slowly it started to click. One of our readings in that subject was called Working with and Learning from Country, Decentering Human Authority by the Gaywu group of women who also did the book Song Spirals. And on that paper, the first author was listed as Bawaka country, which is the subject of the paper. That one's about hunting in Bawaka country on Arnhem Land. And in that paper they say, we propose that practicing relational research requires researchers to open themselves up to the reality of their connections with the world and consider what it means to live as part of the world rather than distinct from it. Country and everything it encompasses is an active participant in the world, shaping and creating it. It is far from a passive backdrop to human experience. So after I read that paper, that's when I really started to understand the idea that country has awareness. The instructions for the first assessment in I&D 203 said, you will need to discuss the interrelationships and interconnections between people and country. That assessment was talking about how people's health and well-being is linked to the health and well-being of country. And I wrote in my essay, people and country are interconnected so closely that what makes country sick will make a person sick. Deborah Bird Rose says, damage to country and to dreamings in particular cause death or injury to people. As senior Bilanara man Jimmy Mangiari explained, when an old man died, a Wallajapu, which is a black-headed python dreaming tree, broke in half, and the water it contained all ran out. So that's when I started to understand how people and country are interrelated and that people can have a relationship with country. And I started trying to develop my own relationship with Turrbal country. So that's what I'll be doing today in this presentation. You'll see how I try to develop that relationship. including going to Germany. Of course, I gotta go there. So this slide shows how my understanding shifted. Before IND, I thought country is alive, like I knew that trees and grass are alive and they're growing, but passive, alive but passive. After IND, I realized country has awareness. Before, I thought humans control and have authority over country. After, people and country are interconnected and equal, have an equal relationship and rely on each other. Before, country is only in the bush or the outback, but not the city or the suburbs. After, I understand that even Brisbane City, where I am, is built on Turrbal and Yagara country. And I'm right here now on Turrbal country. That's where I'm sitting. And Turrbal country still very much exists. A really good example of that is in March, when the whole place flooded in Brisbane. Every suburb of Brisbane flooded because pretty much every suburb in Brisbane has a creek flowing through it. And it was really crazy, like people were trapped in their own suburb, like trapped from one suburb to another. If the equivalent in Melbourne would be like if you couldn't get from Brunswick to Coburg even. That's how crazy it was, like, because the little creeks running through every suburb just filled up and up and up. And so, yeah, we were just like trapped in our little islands of suburbs. And in this room that I'm sitting in now, the carpet flooded. So I can't smell it anymore, but for a solid like 2 months, every time I came into this room to use a computer, the carpet was just dank, like wet carpet smell, as you can imagine. It was just dank and gross, and it was still wet, and there was all insects everywhere, different type of insects that I'd never seen before. That was the aftermath of the flood. It's like, as I sit here now talking, I can smell it in my mind, the wet carpet smell. And what that really made me think about is how we are on Turrbal country. Like, no matter what gets built here, at the end of the day, it's country. And that's the reality of living in Brisbane, is that when the white settlers first came here, the Turrbal and Yagara people said, don't build your city here, like, don't do it, it's on a floodplain. But because the floodplain gave rich soil for the farmlands, the settlers did it anyway. And that's why the carpet stinks right now. That's what I'm trying to get at. That information is from a book called A River with a City Problem. So I'll put that in my reference list. But yeah, I think that's what I'll be trying to display today, is that after I started the unit, the IND units, it was like I was connecting up things like even smelly carpet. I was connecting that up to the idea, well, not the idea, the reality that Brisbane City is built over the top of Turrbal country. And yeah, in Brisbane is like, that fact was just like so apparent that weekend that it flooded. It was like, yeah, it was real. It was right there. Alright, what's next? Alright, so one way that I thought about going about applying the knowledge I picked up in caring for country, I thought about approaching it like as if you would if you were building a friendship with a person. So at first, when you don't really know each other that well, you'd probably use their official name. You'd probably introduce yourself as, like, for example, I'd introduce myself as Claire, not Clack if I was just meeting someone. But as time went on, if you're really hitting it off, then you'd probably use a nickname. So, just to keep rolling with this analogy, I like to think I'm at the nickname stage with Turrbal Country, but I'm still getting to know her, so we'll see. We'll see what happens, but maybe we'll end up being besties like Naughty's era Kim and Paris with their matching shiny bags. Let's see what happens when I get out there. But yeah, basically, that's why I use my nickname Clack instead of Claire, because I'm trying to embed the knowledge I learned in the I&D units in every aspect of this presentation. So yeah, every little choice I made for this presentation has a reason. Also, talking about names, I'll talk more later on about how I've learnt from I&D that in a First Nations worldview, using the correct name for people and places is very important. So yeah, I'm going to talk about that now, and then later on you'll see me at the sign for G-Bung, and I'll talk more about names then. So this is a road sign in Tasmania where they're starting to do dual naming. So alongside the English names that are already up there on the sign, they're adding the Palawa Kani names. And this is about Aboriginal Tasmanian people's continuing connection to their land despite colonisation. This continuing connection is a thread that ran through all of the I&D unit subjects. We learnt that while colonisation meant that people were displaced from their land and separated from their families, acts of resistance, like reclaiming the proper names of places, means that the continuing connection can stay strong and grow. We learnt about resistance a few weeks into the songline subject, where we looked at petitions and a letter that, can't remember his name, but I'll put it in the reference list. The letter that guy wrote to the Queen. So yeah, that was the first time I came across the idea of resistance. Right, so a bit more about names. We got Brisbane City, the future Olympic city, and Turrbal and Yuggera Country, the timeless land Brisbane was built on. So here we've got Brisbane City, the buildings and the houses, the suburbs, the roads, the bridges, and then we've got the Brisbane River, and the traditional name in the Yagara language for the Brisbane River is Maiwar. Maiwar? No, I think it's pronounced Maiwar. The Maiwar. Colloquially, we call it the brown snake. That's the river's nickname. It became brown because post-colonisation, it was dredged to make the bottom deeper, so ships could move through, bringing things to build the city of Brisbane, like wood and, I don't know, nails, whatever else they needed to build the city. So that's the Maiwar. Before colonisation, it was actually shallow enough in some parts for people to walk from one side to the other. So, yeah, people had a very deep connection with it. They lived on the banks, they used it for food, and you could walk across it, so they were very, like, intimately connected with it. Okay, this is Shannon Rusker. He is a Turrbal and Yagara elder, and he's standing next to the Maiwar. So this is a story for the Maiwar. And it says, the story of the river begins with a battle between land creatures led by Yowagara, a goanna, and water creatures led by Gawanda, a dolphin, which carves dry gullies into the landscape. And years later, when Kaburagan, the rainbow serpent, wriggles her way into a tight gully and gets stuck, she calls upon her brothers Yarrow, the rain, and Nagalan, the clouds, to help free her. And this is in Shannon's own words, this next bit. He says, when Mugara, the big storm, comes down, Kaburagan is able to slither free, and the gully is opened up to become Brisbane River, which became our life source. So at the start of the Songlines unit, if someone has said to me, can you tell me what a songline is? I really wouldn't have a confident answer. I would have said, it's kind of like a map, but it's also a song, and the songlines are stories, and they're to do with nature and how things made, and they're all around us in Australia, but if you don't have the right knowledge, you can't see them. And I'd say songlines about Chermy and Briggs and Thelma Plum and resistance and art. And this is all true because songlines resist a simple one-dimensional definition. That's what I learned. There's not like one word that you can use to explain what a songline is. It's not a quick answer. So if I'd been asked that question, what is a songline, a month into the subject, yeah, I would have been able to list off what we'd been learning about songlines, but I couldn't really put it all together yet. And I felt like Dennis Denudo, the lawyer in this scene of the castle, when he says, Yeah, it's the vibe, it's the constitution, it's justice, it's law, it's Mabo. No, that's just it, it's the vibe, it's just the vibe of the thing. That was how I felt. But now, after 2 years of studying and completing 4 IND units, I can confidently identify that the story from Shannon Ruska that we just heard is a songline. Because you can clearly see the story take place and take shape on the land. So what did I know about stories before I did the songline subject, or what did I think about them? What did I think I knew? Well, I kind of thought of stories as being made up. I thought they were made up and not real, but still used to teach a lesson about something in real life, like as in the Aesop fable of the hare and the tortoise. So obviously there wasn't really a race between the hare and the tortoise. Like, I don't think so. But the stories used to illustrate the real life lesson, slow and steady wins the race. Another idea I had about stories before during the songline subject was that they could be set anywhere and the location didn't really matter. And I thought that because growing up, I always heard Bible stories like every single night, all the time, because my parents are very Catholic and Christian. So those are the stories I always heard. And one of the big stories in the Catholic tradition is Adam and Eve. So like the fable of the hare and the tortoise, it's used to teach morality and life lessons, specifically that giving into temptation is a sin that will destroy your life. After learning in the IND units that stories connect people to country, I understood that you can't separate a story from a place, and you need to be the right person to tell that story. So yeah, that's the connection. Stories, people and country. Stories, people and place need to be connected, or the story doesn't really make sense. You can't separate a story from a person. A person's body is where a story really lives. And I got that idea from the poet Declan Ferber Gillick. And yeah, I'll show what he says about that in a sec. So after IND and everything that we learnt about stories, I went back to that Adam and Eve story that I heard a million times in my childhood, and I had another look at it through my new IND knowledge lens. And I noticed that it doesn't really say where the story takes place. It says this story is in the Garden of Eden, but it doesn't say where that's really located in the world. And this painting doesn't really help. It demonstrates my point that the location is ambiguous. It's like, I don't know, there's a flamingo I think they're usually in hot climates. There's looks like roses. They usually grow in cold climates. There's some mountains that look like they could be in Switzerland with snow on the top, and then there's a palm tree like in a tropical location. So yeah, it's just all over the shop. But one article I just read suggested that if the Garden of Eden was actually in fact real, it might have been located in the ancient land of Kush, which is modern day Sudan and Ethiopia. So that's in Africa. But the depiction of Adam and Eve here, they're European. It shows them looking very white and European. And a lot of biblical art is actually like that. Like, the place is ambiguous, the people are ambiguous, so the visual part of the storytelling in Bible stories is very ambiguous and doesn't really tell you a lot about where it's actually located. I like this. I like what she's getting at. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So this image speaks to me about my perception of stories before and after studying IND 102. After IND 102, I was inspired to reevaluate what I thought I knew through my new IND lens. So go back and think about that Adam and Eve story again. In week 4 of IND 101, Introduction to Aboriginal Studies, we learnt about terra nullius, and this made me examine how some of my beliefs prior to the IND units were influenced by terra nullius. For example, I mentioned that I thought country was only in the bush, not in the city, and I didn't realise that my house, my suburb, where I grew up, my local area, was located on country. So I hadn't really thought very deeply about First Nation peoples' continuing connection to the places I see every day. I hadn't thought about that the place that I call home is Turrbal country. I guess I thought that this connection only exists somewhere else with less buildings and more nature. Like, maybe there's only continuing connections in the Daintree rainforest. Like, maybe that is country, yeah, because there's more trees there, because the nature has been reserved. Or maybe I thought that country was only in the scenic rim, southwest of Brisbane. Both beautiful places. But it wasn't until I started studying IND that I really began to understand that First Nations people have a continuing connection everywhere on this continent, including right here where I'm sitting right now in front of my computer talking. So going back to this lady's sign, I started to think of this like, if Australia was a book of stories, it's like First Nations people's stories have been erased and written over and replaced by post-colonial stories only. And I'll talk about this more later in one of my videos where I'm at the local RSL in Geebung. But as Professor Bronwyn Frederick says, oh no, sorry, let me see what's next. Oh yeah, this is about my perception of stories before and after the IND units. Let's see. Yeah, so before, I thought the stories were made up, like the tortoise and the hare. After, I realised they have physical evidence in reality, like Shannon Ruska's story of Maiwa. Before, I thought they can be set anywhere. They don't have a specific location, like in the Adam and Eve story, there's flamingos, there's snow, it's like, who knows where that's supposed to be. After, I realised the story cannot be separated from the place. Before IND, I thought stories are in books and they're written down only. After, I realised that stories belong to certain people and belong in people. Like the poet Declan Ferber Gillick, an Aurenti person, says, "This is a yarn. Committing it to paper does the story and its spirit something of a disservice. The yarn came through my body. My body is a proper place for it to dwell and to be heard." Before IND, I thought stories are in the past, talking about past events. After IND, I learnt that stories can be in the past, the future, and the present, and at all times, like the Maiwa. The Maiwa has existed at all times. It still does now. It will exist into the future. It always will be. Before IND, I thought stories had to be linear. Then after, I realised that they can change shape, like in the poem Chermy, as author Ellen Van Neven explains. When they were writing it, we put our own sensibility of place onto the artificial Westfield Mall. Yep. Alright, so this is Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, and let me just go and find her quote. I'll be back in a sec. Alright, I'm back. So, Professor Bronwyn Fredericks. She says, in urban localities, Aboriginal people still have Indigenous belonging and Indigenous ownership of place. This exists regardless of whether multi-storey buildings, freeways, sports grounds and houses have been built within that geographic locality. Fredericks goes on to say, there appears to be no understanding that there can be a continuum of Aboriginal culture. It's as if the past can't exist with the present and multiple identities can't exist with each other. Alright, so Professor Fredericks is talking about localities, locations, and how in these locations, urban locations, there is continuing connections to the past. So what are we looking at? Well, it's a train. It's a Queensland Rail train, and it's been painted with an artwork called Travelling by the Galimba Artists Group, a First Nations creative agency. So there's a few of these trains getting around southeast Queensland, and it's really interesting when you see them moving through the landscape like this. It looks really cool. It's really beautiful, and yeah, having that artwork like embedded, immersed in the landscape, that really shows the continuing connection of First Nations people to the land. Yeah, it is really cool when you see these trains whizzing by. It's just, it's beautiful. Now, locations. Talking about locations again. Let's locate myself. Right now, as I speak, I'm in Geebung, where the red star is. And here's the bay. And in a sec, you're going to see Maruchi Baramba, a Turrbal Elder. And in that photo, she's standing like about, where's my mouse go? About here. Nudgee Beach. So just keep that in mind. Maruchi Baramba on Nudgee Beach. What else? Here's the Maiwar. Here's the suburb of Chermside, where Chermy Shopping Centre is. And there I am, in Geebung. Alright, so I'm on Turrbal Country. That map I just showed is all Turrbal Country. So on this map we got Turrbal. I'm on Turrbal, that's the north side of Brisbane. We got Yagara, southwest of Brisbane. Waka Waka, northwest of Brisbane. Gubbi Gubbi, north of Turrbal, Yugambeh, south of Turrbal, and that's Ellen Van Nieven's country. The islands, Quandamooka and Gower. I don't know why that name Gower is there. I think maybe this map's a bit old because I've heard a different name for Moreton Island. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I'll find out because I'm not sure about that name Gower. So I'm on Turrbal country, but the question is, where are the Turrbal people now? Alright, so this is what it says off their website. This is their story in their own words. The Turrbal people have been the custodians of the Brisbane area for many thousands of years. The Turrbal people are not all dead and gone. We are alive and well, and our compelling story goes back to the heroic and inspiring survival of Maroochy Barumba's great-great-grandmother named Korkoroa. Today there are under 50 surviving members of the Turrbal tribe. We were previously a tribe of 3,000 plus before the widespread massacres. So here's the timeline. 1823. 3 British castaways get lost off the coast of Sydney, one of which ends up living with the Ningi Ningi clan on the Redcliffe Peninsula. Ningi Ningi is one of the clans making up the Turrbal tribe. 1824. The first convict settlement in Queensland is established in what is today called Redcliffe. 1825. The convict settlement is relocated south from Redcliffe due to mosquitoes, bad moorings, and the people. The Ningi Ningi clan had a reputation of being kind, but also wild. So that's what the Turrbal people are saying about themselves, like one of their own clans. They were kind but wild. Post 1825, what happened then? The settlement of the British in Meanjin leads to interracial tensions between the Turrbal tribe, who are known as the Old Brisbane tribe, and the British. These tensions ultimately result in the genocide of the Turrbal people, leaving few survivors. 1860s. Historical records state that the Turrbal tribe is on the verge of extinction. 1860s. The British drive out the survivors of the Turrbal tribe, who are then forced to seek refuge on the fringes of Brisbane. 1890s. Laws are passed in Queensland that serve the purpose of protecting the Aboriginal population from further extinction. Consequently, all Aboriginal people are rounded up and placed on reserves. The Turrbal people end up on Barumba Aboriginal Reserve, later renamed to Cherbourg and Taroom. So, on this map, where it says Brisbane City here, that's Turrbal country. So this map is like the local council areas. So you can see how the countries all got split up into local council areas. So the Turrbal people were moved off their country up here, 3 hours northwest away, to Cherbourg. Yeah, so that's what happened with the 1890, what was it called? Like Protection of Aboriginals Act in Queensland. the act. The Turrbal people were taken from their country 3 hours away to Cherbourg. Having said that, I mean, there are Turrbal people that still live on their country, but that's just talking about the displacement of people from their country because of the act. So the Turrbal people finish off their story by saying, since the 1890s, we have been keeping our cultural identity alive within our ancestral homelands. So, yeah, the Turrbal people are still here, they are still on Turrbal country, they are keeping their cultural identity alive on their ancestral homelands, which is now called Brisbane. The Turrbal people are still here. This is the sign at the front gate of Cherbourg. So down the bottom it says, many tribes, one community. So that kind of speaks about the displacement of people, that they were all moved off their country to this reserve. Many tribes, one community. And it also speaks of the unity of the people of Cherbourg. So this is Maroochy Barumba. She is a Turrbal elder and a songwoman. She's an opera singer. And she's shown here standing on her country, wearing a possum skin cloak painted up with stories of her ancestors and her people and her country. So she's showing her connection to her stories and her country by wearing the cloak and being on her country, and through her songs, that's how she keeps her continuing connection strong. Maroochy Barumba. And this is yours truly on the same beach in June 2018. So that's me locating myself on Turrbal country. So that's me standing on Maroochy Barumba's country. Alright, so that was June 2018 now. Let's go back in time. No, forward in time, or back in time from now, but forward in time from that photo. June 2020, what was happening in the world at that time? There was two big things. First of all, the coronavirus pandemic, and second of all, the Black Lives Matter movement really kicked off all around the world, and there was a huge global movement for equality and justice for Black and First Nations people that was going all through the world, as well as the coronavirus. So June 2020 was a very interesting time for the world, where a lot of things changed and came to the surface. This is a Black Lives Matter rally in Melbourne in June 2020. So I went along to that, and then I went home and sat on the couch and looked at Instagram because there was nothing else to do at that time. And this picture cracks me up because I just typed into Google Images person looking on Instagram sad, and this image came up and it looks exactly like me, and the room she's in looks exactly like the room that I was in June 2020 when I was sitting there like that, scrolling through Instagram, wearing trackies, that brown sliding door in the background, and the shelf and the plants and the couch even looks exactly like the room I was in June 2020. So yeah, this is what I was doing at that time, looking on Instagram, and that was me, except my hair would have been messier, my clothes would have been stained, and there would have been like chip packets on the couch, and in the background my sister would have been yelling at me. But yeah, this is like the optic basically of how I spent June 2020 in the pandemic, looking on Instagram. And on Instagram there was a lot of stuff like this. So this is talking about how to be a good ally, and it says, do not center this narrative around yourself. Whilst it is nice that you can relate and empathize, now is not the time to insert your personal experiences into a narrative that isn't about you. This is actually harmful and takes away from the severity of the situation. Leave your ego. So yeah, that was like me on the couch, scrolling on Instagram, like how to be a good ally, and then looking at stuff like this, and then thinking, alright, got it, cool, that's how you be a good ally. Easy. So one of the commentaries at that time was that people in Australia have only started to care about Black Lives Matter when we saw it in America, and just to remember that the stuff that's happening in America has been happening to First Nations people in Australia since colonisation. And yeah, like, it's time to focus our attention more on what is actually happening here rather than in America. So that's what these girls' sign is referring to. Same story, different soil. And that was something that I thought about a lot in June 2020. Like, yeah, I do think about America a lot, like probably more than what's going on here. Like, this is how I put it. I thought, okay, I know all about Nicki Minaj, but it's time to learn about Nikki Winmar. So I got on the phone to Deakin University and I said, is there any subjects I can do that I can learn about Aboriginal history? And they told me about the I&D units. So 3 weeks later, I enrolled in Songlines, and this is one of the first images that we saw in the lecture from week 1 in Songlines. This is Seven Sisters Songline by Josephine Mick. So just keep in mind the shapes that we can see on this image. The important thing about this image is that there's no straight lines. It's a map of Australia, but we don't see any straight lines like on the map you see where it's Queensland, New South Wales, etc., all cut up into different states. On this map, there's no straight lines. The shapes reflect the shape of the land as it was before colonisation. The Seven Sisters Songline by Josephine Mick. Alright, locatedness. I'd never heard this term before I did IND, and I really had no idea what it meant. I just never ever heard about it. So this is from the IND 101 Assessment Task 3 Reflective Task Rubric. One of the criteria said that to do well in the assignment, you will show excellent knowledge of content and engagement with locatedness of self and growth in cultural understanding. So the task was asking us to think about ourselves and reflect on our own thoughts and how that had changed. Yeah, but asking us about ourselves. And then in the IND 101 criteria sheet for Assessment Task 3 Storytelling, Analysis and Reflection, the one that I wrote about David Uniapon, one of the criteria is critical and personal reflection on the synthesis of traditional and contemporary and significant... Oh, hang on, what's that? Sorry, let me start again. Criteria 3, critical and personal reflection on synthesis of traditional and contemporary and significant in current day lives. Highly attuned, critical and revelationary, that's it, personal reflection which intensively and comprehensively examines the synthesis of the contemporary and the traditional, supported by evidence, all the elements including the significance of each, how they intersect and change, the importance to Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and why this is personally important. So that criteria was asking us to talk about why the story we chose was personally important to us. And so that's why I talked about David Uniapon and the $50 note, because that had significance for me. But yeah, there's the criteria why this is personally important. So I have to say, at that time, being asked to talk about why things were personally important to me and to talk about myself, it got me a bit confused because I was like, but hang on, I'm white, why would I be talking about myself when I'm doing Indigenous Studies units? And thinking back to the tile that I showed from Instagram, how to be a good ally, I was like, but it says, on that it says to be a good ally. You shouldn't center yourself in the narrative. You shouldn't make it about you. And I was like, why are they asking me to talk about myself? I'm confused. I was confused. Like this lady. And I didn't want to be like Carrie Ann and center myself. So yeah, I was just, really confused as to why I should be talking about myself in Indigenous Studies units when I was like, but, it's meant to be about Indigenous people and culture and worldviews. Like, I don't really want to be talking about myself. But that's what the criteria is asking me to do. And yeah, like I said, I was confused. But that was when I started the study of IND. And that changed as I went along further in the subjects, and then I got some clarity about why is were asking us to talk about ourselves and reflect on our beliefs and experiences throughout the unit. It started to click why you were asking us to do reflections, and this is my take on it. Alright, so in this project now, I'm locating myself within these stories on Turrbal country. I'm noticing what's around me and I'm narrating to it, but the main character in the videos is not me, it's Turrbal country. I am one small part of an existing story. Since colonisation, the dominant narrative in Australia has been about making progress and moving forward and centering the settler colonial narrative over the First Nations narrative. My family is here in Australia due to practices of colonisation, so I'm part of that settler colonial story. But for thousands and thousands of years before the settler colonial narrative started, there were songlines everywhere, and they are still here. So everywhere we go now in 2022, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, we're in these songlines. The songlines are surrounding us everywhere we go on this continent. Some of them have been cut up into little pieces, and they're hard to see because they have roads and buildings on them, but they still exist. And I'll demonstrate on a map later on how some of the songlines have been cut up into little pieces, but they're still here. So now after 4 IND units, I now do understand that what you were asking us to do in our reflective tasks was place ourselves as one part of a whole. And maybe see where me and my family, people in the settler colonial narrative, can fit within a First Nations narrative. So that's what this image is about. It's like on the left at the top is just this guy, and he's the top of the food chain, and he's like dominating everything. It's all about him. And it's in a triangle, which has straight lines. So then on the right, the guy, he is just one part of a whole. He's in the circle with everything else in nature. He's not more important. He's not dominating. He's just one part of the whole. So I think the left, the triangle, represents the settler colonial narrative, with this guy being the settler colonial narrative, dominating at the top. It's all about him at the top of the triangle. And then on the right, I'm going to say this symbolizes more the First Nations narrative, where people are one part of the whole. So people are not putting themselves above the other elements in nature, like plants, sea creatures, snakes, etc. Yeah, I think part of the First Nations worldview has to do with seeing people as in communion with nature, one part of the whole, rather than being at the top and having authority over nature, which is what that Gateway Group of Women paper was talking about, decentering human authority. That's what they were getting at, like more this image of the right in the circle, that's more closely aligned with the Yolngu worldview than the triangle on the left. Alright, so that's to do with my take on the settler colonial narrative and the First Nations worldview. And when I go out on Turrbal Country in the videos, you'll see that I'm more trying to place myself within this more circular way of thinking, rather than the way it's been done here since 1788, which I think is kind of like this, like when we used to use whiteout in high school to literally white something out, erase the First Nations narrative and write over the top of it. That's my analogy for the settler colonial narrative, going over the top of the First Nations narrative. Yeah, so it's all about stories. That's the main way I've applied the IND knowledge to my life, is mainly through the framework of stories. Alright, so now we really get into it. Applying knowledge, embedding the IND unit knowledge in the world around me. So now my project's about linking stories to places. So that's why I'm going to those places and making a video, rather than just showing a photo of the places and then talking about it without being there, just sitting behind the computer. I'm actually going to the places to show how, in the First Nations worldview, people, story, and places are inextricably linked and cannot be separated. So I put myself, a person, into those places, and I talk about the stories of the place, the First Nation stories, the settler colonial stories, and also my stories of those places, so the Clack stories. But I want to make this really, really clear. I'm not telling the First Nation stories of these places because I am not the proper person for telling the stories. I'm just identifying them and talking about the First Nation stories. I'm not telling them. I just want to make that distinction really clear. I am acknowledging the stories. I'm identifying them. I'm seeing them. I am not telling them because I'm not qualified. I'm only qualified to tell my own stories, the Clack stories, so that is what I do tell. But the First Nation stories of the places, I acknowledge them rather than tell them. Alright, so in that article that we read about the, how do you say it, Nganji seasons calendar from the Daly River, in that article, the researcher Emma talked about the importance of teaching and learning on country from her teacher, Patricia. So in the IND units, my teachers were Rebecca, Jenny, and yourself, Jess. So now I've got the teaching and I'm ready to go out on Turrbal Country and begin the learning. Sorry, I was just reading the map, just looking at all the little details. Alright, so yes, I do. I do wish to log off and go out on Turrbal Country and begin the learning. So let's get stuck into it. Let's get out on Turrbal Country and find these continuing connections. Alright, so that brings me to part 2 applying the knowledge, looking for the spirals. Alright, so stay tuned. I'll be back in a sec with part 2.